As promised in my previous iPad video, here's another video getting into a bit more detail into the specs for the recently announced iPad Pro. We might geek out a little bit on this one, but I hope it goes some way in helping you choose the right iPad Pro for you. Before we start, take a look at this comment here in my previous iPad video from Anthony. This is a perfect example of someone who will actually benefit from the iPad Pro top tier specs. Anthony says he shoots a Canon R5 and he shoots 8K 4K HQ and 4K 120 frames per second. That's some serious overheating, serious large files and a lot of processing power needed to process those files. The new season is rapidly approaching for his work in nature videos and he'll benefit from the top of the range iPad immediately with those accurate colors and sheer processing power, all of those things that are coming with the M1 processor. Anthony is definitely what I would class as a pro user. And by now you watched hours and hours of videos on YouTube about the iPad Pro with people talking about the M1, Retina XDR, Thunderbolt, and like me, you're sold on the idea, but now all you want to know is which spec to go for. If you're about to hit that buy button today, consider the points in this video beforehand. I made it easy for you and put some timestamps here to help you navigate the content. Let's get a couple of things out of the way very quickly. The first one is the screen size, 11 or 12.9 inch, and they're both getting the same processor. So if you have an 11-inch iPad right now and you're thinking about upgrading simply because your current tablet is running slow, then the new 11-inch will probably be okay for you. All you have to do then is choose between the different storage options. So if that's you, head over to the storage chapter. But if you're considering the 12.9-inch, then watch on because it gets a bit more complicated. In terms of camera, front and back, battery, video recording capabilities, speakers, sensors, all of those things, they're the same on both iPad Pros. So let's cover what's not the same. Starting with the new display, the 12.9-inch has Liquid Retina XDR, which is new on the iPad Pro and something that Apple borrowed from their Pro Display XDR product. In simple terms, this technology is to help you with better viewing angles, brightness, contrast ratio, right? The ability to have really bright parts of an image right next to a very dark part of the image. And this is something that every display you look at today struggles to reproduce. So the Retina XDR option is going to be useful if you really care about color accuracy in your trade, in your work, and indeed you plan to be using your iPad for that, like my viewer Anthony at the beginning. And we all know we're not about to get full fat Photoshop experience, for example, on the iPad right now. You can still use things like Lightroom, which is great, but we're now down to the law of diminishing returns. Ultimately, there's a limit in what our eyes can see, and the closest the technology gets to that, the less noticeable it will be. Even though in some of the specs, we're talking about doubling, tripling, or in Apple language,
over 1,500 times faster.
Anthony knows exactly why he needs those new features for his work. But if, like me, you're not too sure right now on, how those features would benefit you, then there's an option to wait a little longer, maybe just a few more weeks. The entire tech community, including myself, are almost 100% sure that Apple are planning to announce something quite big for the iPad Pro in June at WWDC, which is their developer conference, where they usually announce major software updates. So we're talking 4 or 5 weeks max now. If you're not sure about how you would use those extra bells and whistles, and you can wait, I'd wait those few weeks, because otherwise you could end up spending a lot more than what you need, and that's not good. Yes, you will be able to watch movies and Netflix in a greater resolution if you buy the iPad Pro right now, but let's face it, it's pretty damn good anyway. If you've already got an iPad, you're not really going to analyze every single pixel to see if Pablo's shirt here is the right tone of yellow. You don't really need Retina XDR for that. You might think that there's a big difference on the display as well between the 11 and the 12.9 inch when you look at the resolution, and you may assume that the higher resolution is better, which is fair enough. And technically, you'd be right. You are getting a higher resolution on the bigger one of 2732 by 2048, which is slightly higher than the 11-inch. But what's really giving you a better image quality is not the amount of pixels on the display, is the tech behind those pixels. That 2D backlighting system with 2500 local dimming zones, that's what's going to give you the better contrast ratio and the better brightness. The resolution itself is just tied to the size of the screen in this case. But we could be getting into the law of diminishing returns again. If you already have an iPad Pro, say the 4th gen, that iPad Pro has the same resolution. Okay, you don't get the same full, 1000 nits max brightness, but a lot of the display features like the 120Hz promotion, true tone and wide color gamut are already there on the 4th gen. So an upgrade for you would only see a very small return. In my case, coming from the 1st gen iPad Pro, I will see a much bigger leap in refresh rate, contrast ratio, or obviously the brightness, therefore a much bigger return. It's just something to keep in mind, guys. Apple is the GOAT when it comes to marketing, and they will make us all believe that these new features are the best things since sliced bread. But just be mindful of that law of diminishing returns. You can get caught into that marketing rat race. And okay, let's talk about the M1 chip. We can't talk about the M1 chip without talking about memory. Apple being Apple made it very awkward for people to choose the right spec here. By now you will have heard that based on the current iPadOS apps, there is absolutely no point in buying the 16 gig RAM version, because unless you're really pushing it, even the previous iPad Pro already had more than enough capacity to run the current apps. So we have to believe that Apple is announcing some sort of Pro app support on these iPad Pros, because otherwise it's like just buying a Ferrari just to keep it in the garage. You're never really going to experience what that machine is capable of. Still hurts. We have to trust that Apple have plans to enable Final Cut, the Adobe Suite, Logic and Xcode, all of those things, for example, to run on the iPad Pro in some way, shape or form. Buying the 16 gig right now is effectively gambling on the fact that Apple will give us something in the near future. So a bit like the display, if you're not sure, wait a few weeks, wait for that announcement. There are a handful of apps right now that would benefit from having more RAM. Take Procreate, for example. The more RAM you have, the more layers you'll be able to use in the app for any given size of canvas. It's a really good popular app on the iPad, and please don't take my word for it. I checked this with a real pro, Brad from Brad's Art School. On an older iPad with 4 gig RAM, using a canvas size of 3000 by 3000 pixels, you can create 55 layers. On a smaller canvas size of 2000 by 2000 pixels, 130 layers. So we can assume that on an 8 gig RAM iPad, you'll be able to work with about 110 layers on a 3000 by 3000 pixels canvas size. That's a lot of layers. And I checked this with Brad, and his channel, by the way, is a must if you want to learn about illustration. His, well, like I don't know, 500,000 subscribers, brilliant content. And he agreed with me that for most people, 16 gig won't matter. When it comes to Procreate, anything above 25 layers is more than fine for the majority of people. When it starts to matter is for people who are doing work that will be printed, for example. Those guys do need a bigger canvas size, and as the canvas get bigger, you lose the amount of layers. So people working with things like comic book pages and editorial illustration, they will definitely want more layers and large canvases. But that's a very small percentage of people, and 8 gig will feel for them like a very good upgrade. 16 gig basically means they'll never have to worry about canvas size again. Brad, thanks so much for that info. You're the best. Right, so both 11-inch and 12.9-inch will have the exact same desktop class processor in the super capable M1 chip with 8-core CPU and 8-core GPU. It's just like nuts. And as we just discussed, the 16 gig RAM will be for people who are serious about running pro apps in the future and using the iPad for that rather than the laptop, and they will definitely take advantage of that extra RAM. If you don't see yourself needing that sort of power, then consider the lower capacity options, which leads us to storage options. If you're not in that camp that really will take the iPad to the max and pushing the iPads like a real pro, hypothetically speaking, using Photoshop, Premiere Pro, Final Cut and so on, then there's 3 options for you: 128 gig, 256 gig or 512 gig. But who are these options for? I would say that 128 gig is good enough for most people who really don't care about those pro apps and don't really consider themselves as heavy tablet users. I can see this option being very popular in the corporate world, for example, in schools, but also if all you want to do is watch movies, do video calls and take notes and do the occasional gaming. With the ability to offload apps like we do already have that on the current iPads and re-download them when you need them, whilst still retaining your preferences, it becomes really hard to justify half a terabyte or even 256 gig for that matter. Yes, apps will only get bigger, and with the camera quality being better on the iPad, you might be tempted to use the iPad Pro to take photos and videos. But let's face it, most people will still use their smartphones for that. And if you're not using those pro apps, you're not really generating large files that actually need to be stored locally. But if you have lots of high-end games, and is that even a thing on iPads? I mean, I don't know, but lots of games, or you have a massive music library, for example, with lots of really high quality content, then 256 gig or half a terabyte, I don't know, that feels wrong even say it, but that might be for you if you do need those larger files stored locally. But don't press buy just yet, dismissing the 128 gig, because with Thunderbolt 3 You can use one of these external SSDs like the SanDisk Extreme, for example, or the Samsung T5 or T7, which are much cheaper than the Apple storage, and it will give you 1 terabyte or 2 terabyte and fairly decent transfer speeds. So rather than buying the expensive storage options from Apple, invest that money that you saved in external storage and docking options, which will be a much smarter move. I'll put a few links in the description for you of the storage options that I will be using and the docking options that I'll be using as well. So if you are worried about 128 gigs not being enough, consider these options as well. In conclusion, for most people, the 8 gig RAM configuration is more than enough. Considering the CPU is the same on both options, for most iPad apps, like any apps for that matter, the limiting factor is going to be RAM. Storage option is not going to make a noticeable difference for most workflows, so if you're planning on using high-intensive graphic apps, then go for the larger memory option of 16 gig. If you're not sure how we're going to use that extra power, wait a few weeks, 4 or 5 weeks maybe. But if you are like Anthony or Brad and you are a real pro, hit buy on the 16 gig RAM, and I'll see you and your smiling faces on the next one.